was in high school when I first experienced Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and it was my love and admiration for Ramona Flowers and Scott Pilgrim's bass tone that I thought only one of these could persevere for years to come. Fast forward to today's video, I thought I'd show off the process for recreating that glorious bass tone. I did a few Sex Bomb covers last year, and on those videos I received quite a few comments inquiring on how I was able to replicate it, so I figured I'd come on here and try to showcase how I ended up getting that sound. I also never wrote down anywhere how I did it, so I actually have to recreate it from scratch for this video, and I hope for the sake of my credibility I can pull it off. To begin, I have no idea how the tone was created. I've never looked up any videos or guides on how to do it. I'm not even sure if there's any behind the scenes footage of Beck's recording process for the soundtrack. I will say that I don't think there's any one specific way you can make this sound, but I certainly have a few pointers on how to do it. Let's start by setting up the bass. To start with, I'm using my Yamaha RBX bass because it's all I have. It has a volume for each pickup, but for now I've set the split coil to full volume, whereas the single coil is completely off. I will probably change this later, but for now I want to use this as a bass so I can figure out the pedals and amp before I make any other adjustments. Next up we have the amp sim. Previously for the videos that I made, I used the Big Stack amp sim in Logic, which is modeled after an Ampeg, I believe. However, since then, I've purchased a Universal Audio Ruby pedal that I want to try out in place of that one. The reasoning is simply that although Logic amp sims are passable in a mix, on their own they do come across as a bit dull or just kind of lacking in overall dynamic range. And although the Ruby is a guitar amp sim as opposed to a bass one, I figured that it'll sound fine if I set it just right. I set the pedal close to how I imagined the one in Logic sounded. I didn't actually try to match the sound perfectly. Instead, I just tried to reconstruct it from memory, which I believe sounded something like this. It's pretty basic as far as sounds go, but the thing is I had to adjust the Ruby so that the treble frequencies were a bit dampened. That entailed turning the treble down a considerable amount and making use of this tone cut knob, which cuts some of the high end. Vox amps tend to be really chimey, which this knob helps mitigate, but it also just works for the purposes of bass because I wanted the low end to be more present in the sound. With that out of the way, let's move to the pedals. I've seen tons of comments online discussing how to achieve this tone that just say, oh, just buy a Big Muff and you're there. But I don't really like that answer. Big Muff on bass is fine, but I don't think the tone of it is quite the same as Scott's. To me, his tone is more meaty and hefty, not as compressed as the sound of a Big Muff. When I made my Scott Pilgrim covers, I remembered I used a full tone OCD into a Boss DS1. The pedals used to recreate the sound were just simply informed by what I felt like when I was listening to the music. I remembered I used both of them, so I kind of just went off of that going to the recording of this video. Let's start with the OCD. The OCD, as I mentioned before, is a bit of a muddy pedal, and with bass, it's no exception. I think it can work well depending on the amp you're using, but in the case of the Ruby, it was somewhat untamable. I assumed it would be a great stepping off point seeing as I used it before, but it was a bit tricky to dial in properly, and I tried for a while, but I couldn't get a sound that I liked, so I just decided to abandon this pedal for the time being and switch off to the other pedal, the Boss DS1. To my surprise, this pedal was extremely easy to dial in. I think the main concern with this one is the tone knob. Moving it just a little bit goes a long way, so you have to make tiny micro adjustments until you get the exact sound you're looking for. The gain adjustment was fairly easy, just turn it down until some of that high-end fizziness goes away. And since I'm using this pedal to be loud, there's nothing better than to crank the volume. Here's what I came up with. Honestly, I think it's fairly close, and you could probably get away with using just this pedal alone to create the sound, but I think there are still some ingredients missing to make it complete. The tone is good, but to give it that extra oomph, I want to stack it with another pedal, and I think I know just the one. Let's go back to the OCD. Instead of using the OCD to recreate most of the sonic character of this tone, I opted instead to work backwards and set it more like a boost pedal. Here it is on its own, just amplifying the normal amp sound. Of course it sounds good for what it is, but let's stack it with the DS1 and see what we got. it's close. The more I played around with this sound, the more I felt like it could use a bit more treble, so I decided to turn up the volume of the bridge pickup to max so that both pickups were fully on. Personally, I think that this added a certain character that the tone really needed. Now, keep in mind when stacking pedals, there's two things to note. Number one, stacking any two dirt pedals means that the signal will be loud. And number two, whatever pedal is closest to the amp in the chain is the pedal that will probably affect the sound the most. If you have a pedal that you like to use that you want that particular sound, having it as last in the gain part of the chain before the amp is optimal. But that said, some pedals just work better stacked before other pedals. I personally prefer to stack overdrives into distortions into fuzzes, but that's just from my own personal experience. The best thing I can recommend for you to do to get the sounds that you're looking for is to just experiment. It might seem daunting or a chore, but the fact is sometimes the actual experience of trial and error is key to helping you learn and develop your tone shaping skills. Going back to the first point, this tone in particular is great, but it's so incredibly noisy thanks to the two pedals. The DS1 is already a bit of a noise machine, but push it with an overdrive and it's sometimes grating to the ears, especially when you're not even playing anything through it. Thus, I added a noise gate just to keep the signal silent in case I accidentally bump the guitar or move the strings or anything like that. The last step in the process is just to add a bit of mastering effects. Normally, I would add a compressor, a limiter to increase the overall volume, and an exciter. Without these things, a mix can end up sounding flat or dull. The limiter helps to increase overall volume because usually tracks will sound much quieter without this, and the exciter works to highlight certain frequencies to make them pop in the mix. I normally add all these manually, however Logic now has a new mastering tool that I wanted to give a try, so here's a comparison of the two. One final point I really want to stress is you don't need to copy my exact gear to get the right sounds. There's probably 100 different methods you can use with different amp sims, actual amps, DI, DAW, pedal shenanigans. It all depends on your setup. Personally, I think creating a platform that sounds good first and foremost is key, and then you can go back and adjust things later if you have to. At long last, here's the finished product, the perfect Scott Pilgrim bass tone. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave suggestions and thoughts about this video or things you would like to see in future videos in the comments below. As always, you can support me on Ko-Fi as well as check out some of my original music on Bandcamp, Spotify, Apple Music, and right here on YouTube. If you like this video, please consider checking out some of my other videos where I do more stuff like this. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.